to look at the amygdala, in this case, the right dorsal amygdala. This is a brain region that it's very popular because when people are experiencing emotion, this is an area that becomes very active. So when spinning on the negative self-beliefs, I'm not good enough, people don't like me, we found very strong amygdala activity. But I want to show you what happens during these conditions. Spinning on my own negative belief, shifting my attention to the breath. Healthy controls, some reactivity, some downregulation. Social phobics at baseline, a delayed, but then a rapid increase and then subsequent decrease in amygdala response during spinning on negative beliefs. So it takes some time to billow up spinning on the belief, and the amygdala, the brain, this part of the brain, is literally reacting to these negative beliefs. Now, this is pre and post. The black is pre, the same people, pre-mindfulness training. Orange is post. And there are a few things that I want to point out. First, here, there's an initial burst in the people after the mindfulness training in this amygdala reactivity when spinning on beliefs. One of the things that happens when you slow down and when you become more aware of body, thoughts, emotions, is that you become more aware. That's not always pleasant, but that's not, the goal is not to remove what's unpleasant. It's to be more aware. So one way to interpret this initial burst is that people, in this case the social phobics, were actually more aware of their emotional reactivity when they were confronted with their own negative beliefs. Greater emotional awareness. But notice that then it quickly dropped. Notice that this occurred before the instruction to shift their attention to the breath. What was initially a cued, effortful process to shift attention to the breath, after 2.5 months, these people shift to the left and start to implement attention regulation automatically. Perhaps with awareness, perhaps not. Meaning that what was an effortful practice becomes automatized. I just wanted to give just a little bit here because this is something that's really exciting, which until recently no neuroscientist would ever touch. Now there's a burst of interest in, can we not find the self? That's not the enterprise, because there is no central brain region of self. But there are different ways of manipulating how a person views themselves. And you can see that in the brain. So here's one version of the self, analytic, narrative view of myself. This is past, future-oriented. How was Philippe yesterday? How is Philippe going to be tomorrow? It's conceptual. It's a fixed concept. And it's associated with ruminating on the self. It's a very conceptual, linguistic-based view of self. In contrast, there's another version of this way of relating to the self, which is really more experiential, present moment focused, which is why this is interesting for mindfulness, continuously changing experience of the self, not a fixed concept. A reduced, overgeneralized memory, which actually has been related to reduction in depression and anxiety. So in terms of creativity, given that this is a very creative place, I was reading in preparation, I was reading some stuff on creativity. The extent to which a person has a fixed view of themselves and their abilities, they perform at that level. The extent to which a person has a more fluid sense of self, less caught up in a fixed conceptual notion, that person, literally in experimental studies, can make associations that are more interesting. They can bring things together that normally are not very closely associated. They have less obstruction in thinking more creatively. The view of self, I think, is at the basis of that kind of intellectual creativity. And neuroscientists are just beginning. It's actually hard to publish neuroscience of self studies, but there's an interest right now. So in terms of these two, more analytic, more experiential, more embodied sense of self. And what we find is there's, across many, many self-studies, you see there's this set of 3 brain regions that come up all the time. These are midline structures. Medial prefrontal cortex, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, and posterior cingulate. These 3 show up all the time. In this particular study, we found it in controls and also social phobics, which is very promising. So this is a very robust when you're doing self-focused attention. Cutting to the chase, what we found here is in the social phobics, post-mindfulness training, we found significant reduction in neural response from pre to post in brain regions having to do with linguistic processing, thinking to yourself about yourself. Cognitive regulation here, more this reductions in metacognitive awareness, parts of the brain that have to maintain a concept of self are reduced. And medial prefrontal, place where self-focused attention tends to occur, also went down. Reduction in thinking, maintaining a concept of self, and self-focused attention dropped in the people who did the mindfulness class. So they had a less of this conceptual, narrative, fixed concept, and had more of an embodied self. And this is the hot colors here are indicating greater attention, actually. So in summary, I hope what I've shown you is that for people who completed the mindfulness class, in the context of a threat stimulus, personally idiosyncratic negative self-beliefs, reduction in emotional reactivity, an increase in the ability to apply different regulation strategies, be they cognitive or attention, and decreases in conceptual sense of self and use of language in the context of one's own negative self-beliefs.